Welcome, everyone, to Easy History Podcast. Today, we're diving deep into a fascinating and often overlooked theater of World War I, the Italian front.
You know, when we think of World War I, we often picture those muddy trenches of the Western Front.
Right.
But the Italian front was a completely different beast fought in the towering Alps with its own unique set of challenges and triumphs.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Italy's path to joining this conflict wasn't as straightforward as some of the other major powers,
Right.
They were actually initially allied with Austria-Hungary, the very empire they ended up fighting.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Well, it all goes back to Italy's unification in the late 19th century. You see, newly unified. Italy had some unfinished business. They still had eyes on territories like Trento and Trieste,
Okay.
which had large Italian-speaking populations, but were under Austrian control. This created this inherent tension, a feeling that their unification wasn't quite complete.
So they joined forces with their rival. That seems counterintuitive.
Well, it was more of a strategic alliance. Italy was feeling isolated after they took Rome from the Papal States, which angered France. They needed powerful friends. And Austria-Hungary, along with Germany, fit the bill. It was a marriage of convenience, not love.
Ah, so there was always this underlying rivalry bubbling beneath the surface.
Absolutely. There's actually a rather chilling anecdote about how after the devastating Messina earthquake in 1908,
Wow.
some Austrian generals actually suggested attacking Italy while they were struggling to recover. It just goes to show how deep the distrust ran even when they were supposedly allies.
Wow, that's cool. So fast forward to 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated, and all hell breaks loose across Europe. World War I begins. What does Italy do?
They declare neutrality at first. Remember, their alliance with Austria-Hungary and Germany was a defensive one. And since Austria-Hungary and Germany were the ones initiating the offensive war, Italy saw a loophole to stay out.
Ah, so they were biding their time, seeing which way the wind was blowing.
Yeah. Precisely, this is where Italy starts playing what some historians call prima donna. They essentially began negotiating with both sides, the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente France, Britain and Russia, trying to extract the best possible deal for joining the war.
Of course, their ultimate goal was to snag those territories they'd been eyeing from Austria-Hungary, right?
Exactly. Trento, Trieste, and even parts of the Dalmatian coast were all on their wish list.
So they essentially auctioned off their allegiance to the highest bidder.
In a way, yes. They eventually struck a secret deal with the Entente, the Pact of London,
Okay.
which promised them these territories in exchange for joining the war on their side. It was a classic example of realpolitik where national interest trumped any ideological solidarity.
It's fascinating how much maneuvering was happening behind the scenes. But I imagine not everyone in Italy was on board with joining this war.
You're absolutely right. There was a fierce internal debate about whether to join the war at all. Even Benito Mussolini, who would later lead Italy into World War II, initially opposed the war before switching sides and being expelled from the Socialist Party.
Wow, talk about a complicated backstory. So in 1915, they finally take the plunge and declare war. But there's another twist, right? They didn't declare war on everyone.
That's right. They declared war only on Austria-Hungary, hoping to maintain ties with Germany. This unsurprisingly annoyed both sides. They wanted to have their cake and eat it too, but it didn't quite work out that way.
So tell me about their initial plan of attack. I imagine they must have had some grand visions of a swift victory.
Well, their General Luigi Cadorna certainly did it. He envisioned a rapid advance capturing Trieste and potentially pushing all the way to Vienna, the heart of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
That's ambitious. Did he seriously think they could pull that off?
Cadorna, like many military leaders at the beginning of the war, underestimated the challenges of this new kind of warfare. He was used to traditional battles of movement and maneuver, not the brutal realities of trench warfare that were soon to become the hallmark of World War I.
And wasn't the terrain on the Italian front particularly challenging? I've read about these battles being fought high in the Alps.
Yes, that's one of the things that made the Italian front so unique and difficult. Imagine trying to wage a war in the towering Alps with its steep slopes, narrow passes, and unforgiving weather. It was a logistical nightmare.
So how did these early battles actually unfold? Was it a swift victory as Cadorna had hoped?
Not at all. Instead of the quick, decisive battles he had envisioned, the Italian army found itself bogged down in a brutal war of attrition.
Okay.
They faced a series of bloody battles along the Isonzo River, often with limited gains and heavy casualties.
So even when they had numerical superiority, they couldn't break through.
That's right. The mountainous terrain favored the defenders, and the Austro-Hungarians, despite facing challenges on other fronts, were determined to hold on to their territory. It was a stalemate, but a bloody one.
I understand the terrain played a major role, but were there other factors that contributed to Italy's early struggles?
Well, the Italian army faced several challenges. Firstly, the static nature of trench warfare, which dominated the conflict, heavily favored the defenders. This meant that the Italians, despite their numerical superiority at times, often found themselves launching costly offensives against well-entrenched Austro-Hungarian positions.
So it wasn't just about numbers, but about the nature of the fighting itself.
Exactly. And then there was the challenge of morale. Many Italian soldiers were conscripts fighting far from home for territories. They didn't necessarily feel a strong connection to this, contrasted with the Austro-Hungarian troops who were often fighting on familiar ground defending their homeland.
So a lack of shared purpose among the Italian troops, perhaps.
You could say that the leadership also played a role. Cadorna, despite his initial ambitions, proved to be a rather inflexible commander, often resorting to costly frontal assaults that resulted in heavy casualties.
Didn't he also have a tendency to blame his soldiers for any setbacks?
Yes, he was quick to criticize what he perceived as a lack of fighting spirit among his troops, further damaging morale.
So a combination of factors, difficult terrain,
Right.
a new kind of warfare, morale issues, and perhaps some questionable leadership all contributed to these early struggles.
Yes, and all of these factors set the stage for what would become a defining moment on the Italian front, a crushing defeat that would etch itself into Italian memory, the Battle of Caporetto.
Ah, yes, Caporetto. I've heard of it, but I don't know much about the details.
Well, it's a story of miscalculation, surprise, and ultimately a devastating defeat that would have far-reaching consequences for Italy.
It sounds like we need to dive into that.
We do, and we will right after a quick break.
All right, so we left off with the Italian front locked in this brutal stalemate, a war of attrition in the unforgiving Alps. And now we're about to delve into this pivotal moment. The Battle of Caporetto set the scene for us, what led to this dramatic turning point.
By the autumn of 1917, both sides were feeling the strain of this prolonged conflict. Austria-Hungary, facing setbacks on other fronts, was desperate for a decisive victory. They turned to their ally Germany for help, and Germany, recognizing an opportunity to knock Italy out of the war, entirely sent reinforcements to the Italian front.
So the stage is set for this major confrontation. Did the Italians see it coming?
Well, Italian intelligence knew that something was brewing. They had picked up on troop movements and other signs of an impending attack, but they underestimated the scale and the force of what the Germans were planning. And Cadorna, despite the previous setbacks, was still clinging to this idea of launching his own offensive, pushing further into Austro-Hungarian territory.
So a bit of overconfidence on his part.
Perhaps he had recently scored a victory at Gorizia, which boosted his morale, but it seems he failed to grasp the shifting dynamics on the battlefield. The arrival of the German troops, including elite Alpine units and stormtroopers, significantly altered the balance of power.
And what about the Germans? What was their strategy going into Caporetto?
The Germans, under the command of General Otto von Below, were masters of infiltration tactics. They had honed these skills on the Eastern Front, and they were about to unleash them on the unsuspecting Italians. Their plan was to bypass the strong Italian defenses along the front lines, infiltrate through the mountainous terrain, and attack from the rear, creating chaos and sowing confusion.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster for the Italians. Did they have any inkling of what was about to hit them?
Not really. The Germans employed a variety of deception tactics to mask their true intentions. They kept their troop movements under wraps, maintained radio silence, and even used dummy artillery positions to mislead the Italians.
Wow, so a carefully orchestrated surprise attack. How did it actually play out?
On the morning of October 24th, 1917, the Austro-German forces unleashed a massive artillery barrage targeting key Italian positions and communication lines. Then, under the cover of fog and smoke, German stormtroopers armed with flamethrowers and grenades surged forward, infiltrating through weak points in the Italian lines.
I imagine this must have been terrifying for the Italian soldiers facing this onslaught.
Absolutely. The suddenness and ferocity of the attack caught them completely off guard. The German stormtroopers, with their aggressive tactics and specialized weaponry, overwhelmed the Italian defenders, creating breaches in the lines that quickly widened.
So the carefully constructed defenses that the Italians had spent months building were essentially bypassed.
In many cases, yes. The Germans weren't interested in engaging in a prolonged frontal assault. They wanted to exploit gaps, sow confusion, and create panic among the Italian ranks.
And did they succeed?
Almost definitely, the Italian Second Army, which bore the brunt of the attack, was completely routed. They suffered heavy casualties, and thousands of soldiers were taken prisoner. The retreat quickly turned into a chaotic rout as panicked Italian troops fled in disarray.
So this wasn't just a defeat, but a complete collapse of the Italian front.
That's right. The speed and scale of the collapse were shocking. The Germans and Austro-Hungarians advanced rapidly, pushing deep into Italian territory, capturing vast amounts of equipment and supplies.
What about Cadorna? How did he react to this disaster unfolding under his command?
Well, instead of taking responsibility for the failures that led to the defeat, Cadorna blamed his soldiers, accusing them of cowardice and lack of fighting spirit. This, as you can imagine, further demoralized the already shattered Italian army.
So a classic case of a leader passing the buck.
Unfortunately, yes, it was a moment of crisis, and instead of rallying his troops, Cadorna's actions only deepened the sense of despair and disillusionment.
It's amazing how a single battle can have such a profound impact on a nation's psyche.
It certainly can. The word Caporetto became synonymous with catastrophic defeat in the Italian language, a stark reminder of the fragility of military power and the devastating consequences of poor leadership. It's a term that still resonates today, a cautionary tale about the perils of overconfidence and the importance of adaptability on the battlefield.
So after this disastrous defeat, where did the Italians go from here?
Well, they were forced to retreat all the way back to the Piave River, a line of defense much further back from their initial positions. It was a humiliating retreat, but it also marked a turning point in the war for Italy, a moment of reckoning that forced them to reassess their strategies, their leadership, and their commitment to the war effort.
So they were essentially pushed back to their own soil.
Hmm.
I imagine that must have had a significant impact on the home front as well.
Absolutely. The defeat at Caporetto sent shockwaves through Italian society. There was a sense of national humiliation, a loss of faith in the military leadership, and growing war weariness among the population.
So how did they manage to recover from this crushing defeat? Did they simply dig in and hope for the best?
Well, they did dig in, establishing a new defensive line along the Piave River, but more importantly, they replaced Cadorna with the new Commander General Armando Diaz, who took a very different approach to leadership.
Tell me about Diaz. What set him apart from Cadorna?
Diaz was a more pragmatic and adaptable leader. He recognized that the key to restoring the army's fighting spirit was to address the needs of his soldiers, to improve their morale, and to foster a sense of shared purpose.
So a more human-centered approach.
Exactly. Diaz focused on improving the living conditions of his soldiers, granting them more leave, ensuring they were properly fed and equipped, and listening to their concerns. He also implemented changes in training, emphasizing defensive tactics and the importance of unit cohesion.
Did these changes have the desired effect?
They did. Under Diaz's leadership, the Italian army underwent a remarkable transformation. Their morale improved, their fighting spirit was rekindled, and they were determined to defend their homeland against the invaders.
So this shift in leadership played a crucial role in their recovery. But what about the situation on the other side? Were the Austro-Germans able to maintain their momentum after Caporetto?
Well, they did push forward after their victory, but they were unable to capitalize on their initial success. Their advance was slowed by logistical challenges, stiffening Italian resistance, and the difficult terrain.
So the same challenges that had plagued the Italians now hampered the Austro-German advance.
Exactly, and as the winter of 1917-1918 set in, the fighting along the Piave River bogged down into a stalemate, much like the earlier phases of the war.
So both sides dug in once again, but I imagine the situation on the Italian front wasn't happening in isolation. What was happening in the wider war at this point?
You're right. Events on the Italian front were closely intertwined with the larger strategic picture of the war, and in 1918, a series of developments shifted the balance of power, ultimately leading to the final act of this bloody conflict.
Sounds like we're about to head into the final chapter of the Italian front story.
We are, and it's a chapter filled with drama, resilience, and ultimately a hard-won victory for Italy.
Let's take another quick break, and then we'll dive into that final chapter.
Okay.
So we're back, and we're about to go into that final chapter of the Italian front in World War I. We left off with the Italians under new leadership, digging in along the Piave River, having repulsed that Austro-German advance after that disaster at Caporetto. What were the key developments that ultimately led to the end of the war on this front?
Well, several factors converged in 1918 to tip the scales in favor of the Italians. First and foremost, the arrival of American troops on the Western Front put immense pressure on Germany, forcing them to divert resources away from other theaters, including the Italian front.
So even though the Americans weren't directly involved in the fighting in Italy, their presence elsewhere had a significant impact.
Precisely. The Germans were now fighting a two-front war, facing fresh and well-supplied American troops in the West, which stretched their resources thin. This, coupled with growing internal dissent and war weariness within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, weakened their ability to sustain a prolonged conflict.
So the Austro-Hungarian Empire, already a patchwork of different ethnicities and nationalities, was starting to unravel from within.
Exactly. Nationalist sentiments were on the rise within the empire, and many of its subjects, particularly those from Slavic groups, saw the war as an opportunity to break free from Habsburg rule. This led to desertions, mutinies, and a general decline in morale among the Austro-Hungarian troops.
So cracks were appearing in the enemy's facade, while the Italians under Diaz were experiencing a resurgence in morale and fighting spirit.
That's right. Diaz's reforms had a profound effect on the Italian army. They were now better trained, better equipped, and more importantly, they were fighting on their own soil, defending their homeland. This renewed sense of purpose gave them a psychological edge that they had lacked in the earlier phases of the war.
So how did this all culminate in the final Italian offensive?
Well, sensing the growing weakness of the Austro-Hungarian forces, Diaz planned a decisive offensive aimed at breaking through their lines along the Piave River. This offensive launched in October of 1918, almost a year to the day after the Caporetto debacle would become known as the Battle of Vittorio Veneto.
And did it go as planned? Were they able to achieve the breakthrough they'd been hoping for?
Yes, it was a resounding success. The Italians, utilizing improved tactics and enjoying a numerical advantage, launched a coordinated assault across a broad front. The Austro-Hungarian forces, demoralized and weakened, put up stiff resistance in some areas, but they were ultimately unable to hold back the Italian onslaught.
What were some of the key factors that contributed to the Italian victory at Vittorio Veneto?
Well, as we've discussed, the improved morale and training of the Italian army under Diaz played a significant role. They were more determined, more cohesive, and more skilled than they had been in the past.
So they had learned from their past mistakes and adapted their approach.
Exactly. They were also aided by the fact that they were now fighting on a shorter defensive line along the Piave River, which allowed them to concentrate their forces and resources more effectively. The Austro-Hungarians, on the other hand, faced logistical challenges. Their supply lines stretched thin, and their forces spread out across a wider front.
So a combination of internal and external factors all working in Italy's favor.
Yes, and there's one more factor we should mention. The psychological impact of the scorched earth tactics that the Italians had employed during their retreat from Caporetto.
Scorched earth, what did that entail?
As the Italian army retreated after Caporetto, they deliberately destroyed infrastructure, crops, and anything that could be of use to the advancing enemy. This created a devastated landscape that hampered the Austro-Hungarian advance and further demoralized their troops.
So a strategic retreat that, in a way, set the stage for their eventual victory.
You could say that it was a desperate measure, but it ultimately contributed to the Austro-Hungarians' logistical challenges and weakened their ability to sustain a prolonged offensive.
So Vittorio Veneto was a turning point, a decisive victory that broke the back of the Austro-Hungarian army. What happened next? Did they surrender immediately?
Well, the victory of Vittorio Veneto triggered a chain reaction of events. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, already teetering on the brink of collapse, began to disintegrate rapidly. Various ethnic groups declared independence, and the army, plagued by desertions and mutinies, was no longer a cohesive fighting force.
So the empire that had stood for centuries was crumbling before their very eyes.
That's right. Facing imminent defeat, Austria-Hungary signed an armistice with Italy on November 4th, 1918, at Villa Giusti, near Padua. This marked the end of the war on the Italian front, just days before the general armistice that would bring an end to World War I as a whole.
So Italy emerged victorious from the war, but at a tremendous cost.
Absolutely. The war had left deep scars on the Italian landscape and psyche. Over 600,000 Italian soldiers had perished, and the economy was in shambles. But despite the heavy price they had paid, there was a sense of relief and pride in having finally achieved their long-sought goal of unifying all Italian-speaking territories under one flag.
They had achieved their territorial ambitions, but I understand there was also a sense of disappointment, a feeling that the victory wasn't quite complete.
Yes. That's where the concept of vittoria mutilata, or mutilated victory, comes in. Despite their victory, the Italians felt that they had been cheated out of some of the territories that had been promised to them in the Secret Pact of London.
So the spoils of war didn't quite match their expectations.
Exactly. They were particularly disappointed by the failure to secure all of the Dalmatian coast, which they considered to be historically and culturally Italian.
And how did this mutilated victory sentiment play out in the aftermath of the war?
Well, it fueled a sense of resentment and frustration, a feeling that Italy had been betrayed by its allies. This sentiment was exploited by nationalist groups, including the fascists, who used it to gain support for their agenda of restoring Italy's greatness and avenging the perceived injustices of the peace settlement.
So the seeds of future conflict were sown in the ashes of victory.
In a way, yes, the mutilated victory became a powerful symbol of national grievance, a rallying cry for those who felt that Italy had been denied its rightful place in the post-war world. And this, coupled with the economic hardships and social unrest that followed the war, created fertile ground for the rise of extremist ideologies like fascism.
Wow, what a complex and ultimately tragic legacy.
It is the Italian front in World War I is a reminder that even victories can be bittersweet, and that the consequences of war often extend far beyond the battlefield.
It certainly is. It's been a fascinating journey through this often overlooked chapter of history. Thanks for guiding us through it.
My pleasure. It's important to remember these stories, to learn from the past, and to appreciate the sacrifices that were made in the name of peace.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Italian front in World War I. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking. Until next time.